At 0347 hours, he heard the dogs, not distant, not approaching, close. He pressed his back against the frozen ground and did not move. His radio was gone, his unit was gone, and the patrol that had been searching the eastern ridge for the last 40 minutes had just changed direction. Toward him, he had maybe 8 minutes before the first handler reached his position. And in those 8 minutes, he made a decision that every instinct, every training protocol, and every rational thought told him was wrong. He didn't run. He turned round and walked straight toward them. The year is 1951. The Korean peninsula has become a frozen corridor of contested land, where front lines shift by kilometers in a single night, and the difference between friendly territory and enemy ground is often invisible until it is too late. He is 23 years old, a reconnaissance soldier attached to a forward unit tasked with mapping enemy movement along the western approach corridor. 3 hours ago, his extraction point was overrun. His partner didn't make it out. And right now, with the temperature dropping below -15 and a search pattern closing in from 2 directions, he is completely alone in terrain that leaves footprints in the snow with every single step. Standard protocol in a situation like this was clear. Fade east. Move toward friendly lines. Use terrain elevation as cover. Keep distance between yourself and the search origin. But protocol assumes you have a head start. He didn't. The patrol had established its search origin less than 400 meters from his current position. That meant the standard evasion corridor east, toward the ridgeline, was already being covered. They hadn't moved toward it yet, but they would. That was how the doctrine worked. Expand outward. Cover the most probable escape routes first. Tighten the circle from the outside in. He understood the pattern because he had studied it. He had trained against it, and he knew exactly what it assumed. It assumed he would run. It assumed that any isolated soldier in hostile territory would do what every biological instinct screams to do in the presence of a threat: move away from it. That assumption was the foundation of the entire search architecture. The dogs were not there to find him where he was. They were there to track where he was going. The handlers would follow the scent trail outward, toward the ridgeline, toward the river, toward the places a man runs to when he is afraid. Running east meant footprints in the snow. Footprints meant a trail. A trail meant the dogs would close the distance within 20 minutes, and at that point, no amount of terrain or darkness would matter. Hiding in place was no better. He had already assessed his immediate surroundings. The ground was open. The snow coverage was inconsistent. There was no natural concealment within 50 meters that would hold against a physical search sweep. If he stayed where he was, the expanding circle would reach him in less than 30 minutes, possibly less. Every option he had been trained to use pointed to the same outcome. They would find him. The only question was whether they found him running or found him hiding. Unless the question itself was wrong. Unless the assumption that he had to move away from them was not a strategy, but a reflex. He lay there in the dark, breath controlled, body flat against the frozen ground, and he thought about the one place they would not search a second time. The place they had already been. Every soldier before him had run. That was not speculation. That was the documented outcome of every similar engagement he had been briefed on. Isolated, separated, pursued. They ran east. Some made it to the river. Some didn't make the ridgeline. None of them had done what he was now considering. They ran because running felt like survival. It looked like survival. It had the shape and logic of survival. He didn't run. He waited until the nearest patrol element was approximately 200 meters to his northeast. He identified the likely path of the dog handler based on the direction the barking had moved in the last 4 minutes. He calculated the area behind the search origin, the zone the patrol had already swept before expanding outward. Cleared ground. Ground they had already decided held nothing. Then he stood up, slowly, and he began to move west, toward the origin point, toward the place the patrol had come from. He moved in a shallow arc, staying low, placing each step in the compressed snow of existing footprints where possible to minimize new impressions. He did not run. Running produces sound, disrupts balance, and creates a visible disturbance pattern in low-light conditions. He moved at a controlled pace, using the darkness and the ambient noise of the wind as cover. He was not escaping. He was hiding inside the search itself. The first 3 minutes were the most dangerous. He was moving in the same general direction as the patrol's origin point, which meant he was temporarily in the zone between two expanding search arms. If either element turned back early for any reason, equipment check, handler rotation, communication, they would walk directly into him. He kept his pace steady, his breathing controlled. He did not look back. Looking back slows movement. Looking back causes hesitation. Looking back is what people do when they are afraid of what is behind them, and fear changes the body in ways that are audible at close range. Elevated respiration, irregular footfall, the small sounds of panic that experienced soldiers are trained to detect. He looked forward, toward the cluster of structures he had identified on the map during the original reconnaissance brief. 3 buildings. Formerly a supply coordination point for the Eastern Push, now sitting in what had become, over the last 6 hours, the inner perimeter of the search zone, already swept, cleared and logged by the patrol before it expanded outward. He reached the outer wall of the first structure at 04:01 hours, 14 minutes since he had heard the dogs. He pressed against the wall and listened. Nothing immediate whined. The distant sound of the patrol moving further east. A voice, faint, giving what sounded like a directional instruction. Moving away, he moved along the outer wall to the northeast corner and looked around it. The interior of the compound was empty. He did not go inside the buildings. That was the second decision that went against instinct. An enclosed structure feels like safety walls. Roof, concealment on multiple sides. Every instinct points toward enclosure when you are being hunted, but enclosed structures are the first places as secondary sweep targets. If the outer search failed to locate the subject, doctrine called for a building-by-building check of all structures within the inner perimeter. He knew this, so he didn't go inside. Instead, he moved to the space between the first and second structures, a narrow corridor approximately 1 meter wide, partially sheltered from wind and almost entirely invisible from any external vantage point. And he sat down against the wall with his knees drawn up and his profile reduced to its smallest possible form. He would wait here for as long as it took. He did not know how long that would be. He began to regulate his body temperature in the way he had been trained. Controlled breathing. Isometric muscle engagement to generate heat without movement. He kept his hands inside his jacket against his core. He monitored sensation in his feet at regular intervals and contracted the muscles in his legs every 3 to 4 minutes to maintain circulation. At 0419, the dogs got louder, not closer. Louder in the way that happens when wind direction shifts and sound travels differently. He identified the shift, exhaled slowly, did not move. The barking was moving southeast, now. The handler was following a scent trail, the trail he had left during his original position, moving in the direction any evading soldier would move. The dogs were doing exactly what they were trained to do. They were following the wrong person. Not a person, a pattern. The pattern of escape. He stayed between the walls. At 0431, he heard footsteps. Single pair. Slow. Moving along the outer wall of the first structure, the same wall he had pressed against 18 minutes earlier. He reduced his breathing to the absolute minimum. 3 seconds in, 6 seconds out. He did not move his hands. He did not shift his weight. He did not close his eyes, because closed eyes change the muscle configuration of the face in a way that can be detected at very close range under certain light conditions, and he was not willing to accept that risk. The footsteps stopped, directly on the other side of the wall. Approximately 1 meter from his position, he heard the soldier light something. A cigarette, from the sound of it. A long exhale. The quiet sounds of someone taking a short, unauthorized break from a search rotation. He waited. The soldier stood there for approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, by his internal count. Then the footsteps resumed and moved away, toward the south end of the compound. He did not exhale loudly. He did not allow himself any physical expression of relief. Relief is a form of release, and release leads to reduced vigilance. And reduced vigilance in the next 60 seconds after a near-detection event is when most people make the mistake that undoes everything that came before. He stayed in position. He stayed in position for another 40 minutes. At 0513, the sound profile of the search changed. The dogs were further. The radio communications he had been tracking by sound pattern had shifted from active search cadence to what he recognized as a post-sweep consolidation pattern. Shorter transmissions, fixed intervals. The sound of a search operation beginning to conclude. They were pulling back. Not because they had found something, because the outward sweep had reached its maximum radius without result. And doctrine said that at that point you consolidate and re-evaluate. They were about to come back toward the inner perimeter. He knew what came next. A secondary check. Building interiors. Any position that could conceal a man. Not the spaces between buildings. Nobody writes a protocol for the space between buildings in a cleared compound because nobody writes protocols for things that don't fit the expected behavior of a fleeing soldier. He stayed where he was. At 0528, 2 soldiers moved through the compound in a standard secondary sweep pattern. He heard them enter the first building, move through it, exit, enter the second. He tracked them by sound and confirmed they were moving in a logical, efficient sweep pattern, exactly what he would have done. They swept the buildings. They did not check between them. At 0541, the compound was quiet. He remained in position for another 22 minutes after the last audible contact. This was the part that most people abbreviated. The search is over. The immediate danger has passed. The body begins producing the chemical signal that feels like safety, and safety feels like permission to move. And movement, at that point, 20 minutes after a patrol has cleared an area, is statistically when isolated soldiers got caught, because patrols come back. Not always, not on schedule, but often enough that the 20-minute window after a search conclusion is one of the highest capture rate periods in any evasion scenario. He stayed still. His feet had lost reliable sensation by 0540. He continued the muscle contraction protocol, but was aware that his window for effective movement was narrowing. Cold, at this level, sustained over this duration, begins to affect fine motor control, first, then balance, then judgment. He needed to move before judgment was compromised, but he needed to move correctly. At 0603, he heard something he had not expected. A single set of footsteps, moving in a pattern that did not match a standard patrol route. Irregular spacing, pauses of varying length. The sound of someone moving without a fixed destination. A soldier, but not on assignment, moving through the outer edge of the compound, apparently without a specific task. He identified 2 possibilities. First, a straggler from the secondary sweep who had deviated from the patrol route for personal reasons. The same reason the earlier soldier had stopped for a cigarette. Second, a deliberate soft perimeter check. An informal walk of the outer edge ordered by someone who was not satisfied with the primary sweep results. A commander's instinct deployed quietly. The second possibility was more dangerous, because a soldier on informal orders moves differently than a soldier on formal ones. He moves with curiosity rather than procedure. He looks at things that fall outside the official checklist. He checks the spaces between buildings. The footsteps came closer. He identified the approach angle. The soldier was moving along the outer wall from the south, the same direction as before, but from the opposite end. If the pattern continued, the soldier would pass within 3 meters of his position. He had a decision to make. He could stay still and accept the risk of discovery at close range. Or he could move now, while the soldier was still far enough away, and attempt to reposition to the opposite side of the building. Moving now meant sound. On frozen ground, at this temperature, even controlled movement produces a perceptible crunch. If the soldier was within 20 meters and paying attention, movement was detectable. He did not move. He changed his profile instead. He lowered himself from a seated position to fully prone, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that takes 3 times longer than instinct prefers. He pressed his face against the base of the wall and pulled his arms in close to his body. From above, he would appear as little more than a shadow at the base of the structure. From the side, at the angle the soldier was approaching, he would appear as nothing at all. The footsteps reached the corner of the building, paused. He heard the soldier breathe. A slow exhale, the sound of someone looking at something without being sure what they were looking at. He did not look up. He stared at the base of the opposite wall, and he controlled his breathing with the kind of focus that requires you to think about nothing else. The soldier stood at the corner for approximately 90 seconds, then moved on. He did not move for another 15 minutes. The search had operated on a set of assumptions. Every element of it, the dogs, the expanding pattern, the secondary sweep, the informal check, had been built on the foundational premise that the subject was moving away from the point of origin, that he was somewhere along the outward arc of probable escape routes, that the distance between the subject and the origin point was increasing with every passing minute. That was what the doctrine assumed, because that was what subjects did, because that was what fear does to a person. It pushes them away from the source of danger and toward the nearest available version of safety, even when that version of safety is already compromised, even when the route toward it is exactly where the search pattern is designed to intercept. He had never entered that pattern. From the moment he turned west instead of east, he had been operating in a space the search architecture had no language for, not hiding from the search, hiding inside the assumption the search was built on. They had looked outward because he should have been running outward. They had cleared the inner perimeter first because the inner perimeter is where you start, not where you finish. They had checked the buildings because buildings are what soldiers hide in, not the cold ground between them. The search doctrine was not wrong. It was correct for every situation it had been designed for. It had simply never been tested against someone who understood it well enough to live inside its blind spot. By 0620, the search had fully consolidated to a position approximately 1 kilometer east of the compound. The radio pattern had shifted to what he assessed as a standing patrol cadence, periodic, fixed, no longer reactive. They had concluded that the subject had either escaped the search radius or had not survived the terrain and temperature. Either outcome removed the urgency, either outcome meant the inner perimeter was no longer a priority. He began to move. By the time they filed the search report, he was already 2 kilometers west, moving slowly, deliberately, using the compressed tracks of the patrol's own vehicles to minimize his footprint in the snow, staying below ridge elevation to avoid silhouette, checking intervals before crossing any open ground. He was not faster than the search. He had never been faster. Speed had nothing to do with it. What he had understood, and what they had not, was that a search does not look for where you are. It looks for where you should be. It constructs a model of your behavior based on what frightened people do, and then it goes to find you there. He had simply refused to be where the model expected him. He crossed back into friendly territory at 0841. He was debriefed for 6 hours. When they asked him how he had evaded a full search element with dogs and a secondary sweep, he described it as a matter of geometry, not courage, not luck, geometry. He had stayed inside, a shape the search had already decided was empty. After the war, he did not speak about that night very often. Not because it was remarkable, but because, the more he tried to explain it, the more it sounded like something other than what it was. It was not bravery. It was not instinct. It was the recognition that, in a moment of genuine danger, the most dangerous thing you can do is behave exactly as your enemy expects you to behave. Every search, he would say, is built on an assumption. Find the assumption. And the search finds nothing.